There are stories in history that begin with trumpets. This is not one of them. This story begins quietly, in a cold room where nobody important was looking. Before she wore a crown, before servants bowed when she entered a room, before her name was written beside kings and queens, she was simply a girl whom almost everyone had forgotten. No royal cradle had been prepared for her. No poet had been waiting to celebrate her birth, and no one, standing beside her small bed on that first winter morning, could have imagined that one day she would sit beneath a golden canopy while an entire kingdom waited for her to speak. She did not look like a future queen. She looked like a child who had learned very early that silence was safer than asking questions. And perhaps that was the first thing that prepared her for the life ahead. Because medieval courts were places where people listened carefully. Not always to what you said, often to what you did not say. So tonight, as we slowly travel backward through the centuries, let us leave behind the noise of modern life. Imagine instead the distant sound of rain against thick stone walls, a single candle burning beside a narrow bed, a wooden shutter moving gently in the wind. Beyond it, a medieval town sleeping beneath a dark sky. There are no engines, no electric lights, no glowing screens, only darkness, firelight, footsteps, and the occasional bell from a distant church. And somewhere inside that darkness, a little girl is awake. She does not know that history has already begun moving toward her. She only knows that tomorrow will probably look much like today. At least, that is what everyone believes. The girl nobody was watching. Her name was Eleanor. At least, that is the name we shall give her here, because the records that survive from this period are incomplete, and the lives of ordinary women were often recorded with astonishing carelessness. Kings received entire pages. Princes received genealogies. Warriors received songs. But a quiet girl in a noble household, sometimes she received only a name in the margin, a daughter, a sister, a footnote, and then, occasionally, history made a mistake. It forgot someone who would later become impossible to ignore. Eleanor was born in the late 12th century, in a world of stone castles, muddy roads, candlelit halls, and long journeys on horseback. She was born into a noble family, though not one of the great families whose banners could be recognized from a distant hill. Her father possessed land. He had tenants. He attended local councils. He knew men who knew other men who occasionally knew the king. But he was not powerful enough to control the kingdom, and that distinction mattered. In medieval society, being wealthy and being powerful were not necessarily the same thing. A family could own a comfortable manor and still spend enormous amounts of time worrying about who was angry with whom. Eleanor's mother died when she was very young. There was no dramatic farewell. No final speech. No priest recording the exact hour. Only a gradual disappearance. One day there was a woman who braided Eleanor's hair. Then there was not. One day there was a familiar voice in the household. Then the voice became memory. Eleanor was too young to understand death in the way adults did. She understood absence. She understood that certain rooms had become quieter. She understood that people spoke differently when they thought she was listening. And she learned that grief in a medieval household was rarely private. There were duties. There were prayers. There were guests. There were meals to prepare, letters to send, land to manage, animals to feed. Life continued with the stubbornness of a wheel rolling downhill. And the little girl had to continue with it. Her father became increasingly distant. Not cruel, simply occupied. There were taxes, disputes, travel, obligations. A nobleman in this period could spend weeks away from home, traveling between estates or attending the court of someone more powerful. So Eleanor was raised largely by women. An older nurse named Agnes became the closest thing she had to a permanent companion. Agnes was not particularly impressed by nobility. She had spent her entire life watching wealthy people worry about things that poor people could never afford to worry about. She had a practical understanding of the world. She knew how to stretch flour. She knew which herbs could settle a stomach. She knew when rain was coming. And she knew that children who were ignored often heard more than adults realized. Eleanor listened. That was her great talent. She listened when servants whispered. She listened when priests spoke. She listened when visiting nobles discussed marriages. And she listened whenever her father returned home. Especially then. A house built of stone. The manor where Eleanor grew up was not a grand palace. It was a practical building. Thick walls, small windows, a great hall that served many purposes. There was no separate dining room, no private bathroom, no comfortable central heating. The great hall was where meals were eaten, visitors received, business conducted, stories told, and sometimes arguments settled. Smoke from the central fire drifted upward toward openings in the roof. In winter, the air smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, roasted meat, and wet leather. The floor was covered with rushes. These were replaced occasionally, but not nearly as often as someone living in the 21st century might prefer. Life smelled strongly in medieval houses. People smelled. Animals smelled. Food smelled. Fire smelled. Rain smelled. And everyone simply accepted this as normal. Eleanor did too. She learned to sleep beneath heavy blankets. She learned that winter mornings were difficult. She learned that warm water was something that had to be carried. She learned that candles were precious. She learned to read a little. Not because anyone believed she needed a grand education, But because her father had a chaplain who believed that daughters of noble families should know enough to read prayers and letters, her lessons took place near a window. The light was better there. She learned Latin slowly. She learned prayers by memory. She learned to recognize important words and letters. And gradually, without anyone noticing, she learned something much more valuable. She learned how people communicated when they wanted something without saying so directly. A letter might begin with affection. Then come several paragraphs of politeness. And somewhere near the end would appear the real request. A marriage, a favor, a payment, a promise, a threat disguised as courtesy. Eleanor noticed these things. She was still a child, but she noticed. The first time she saw the king, when Eleanor was perhaps 10 years old, a royal procession passed near her family's estate. It was not supposed to stop. That was made clear. The king was traveling south. His household moved with him like a small town on wheels. There were knights, servants, priests, messengers, pack animals, carts, horses, guards, people carrying food, people carrying clothing, people carrying documents, people whose entire job seemed to be carrying something that someone else had forgotten. Eleanor had never seen so many horses. She stood behind the wooden gate with Agnes and watched the procession approach. The road was wet. Mud clung to the horses' legs. The banners were heavy with rain. And then she saw him, the king. He did not look quite as magnificent as she had imagined. He looked tired. That surprised her. She had expected a king to look like something carved from gold. Instead, he looked like a man who had been traveling too long. His cloak was damp. His face was serious. His horse moved slowly. And for one brief moment, the king looked toward the manor, toward Eleanor. Their eyes met. Perhaps he never truly saw her. Perhaps she was only another child standing beside a gate. But Eleanor remembered the moment for years. Not because the king had spoken. He had not. But because she suddenly understood something. Kings were people too. They became tired. They became hungry. They became cold. They worried. They made mistakes. And yet entire kingdoms could be rearranged because of their decisions. That realization stayed quietly inside her. She did not know it yet, but she would eventually need it. The marriage question. By the time Eleanor reached 13, adults had begun discussing her future. Not with her. Around her. There was an important difference. Girls of noble families were often treated as pieces on a political board. Their marriages could join estates, end disputes, create alliances, protect inheritance, strengthen claims. A marriage was rarely just about two people. It could be about 50 villages, 3 castles, a border, a debt, or the possibility of avoiding a war. Eleanor understood this gradually. She noticed that certain visitors were suddenly interested in her. Men who had previously ignored her began asking how old she was. Women examined her clothing. A visiting lord's wife once held Eleanor's hand and looked at her teeth. Eleanor found this deeply insulting. Agnes later explained that it was simply part of assessing her health. This did not make Eleanor feel better. She was becoming aware that her future might be decided without her permission. That frightened her, but she did not complain. Instead, she watched. Her father received letters. Some proposals were rejected. Others were discussed. One candidate was wealthy but unpleasant. Another was young but politically useless. A third was much older and already had 2 children. And then there was a fourth, a man whose name Eleanor heard several times. Lord Geoffrey. He possessed land to the east. His family had connections at court. He was ambitious, very ambitious. Her father seemed to like him. Eleanor did not. She had never spoken to him. She did not need to. She had watched him speak to servants. That was enough. He was polite when important people were present. He was impatient when they were not. Eleanor remembered Agnes's advice. Watch how a person treats someone who cannot help them. It was one of the first lessons Eleanor truly trusted. The winter, everything changed. The winter Eleanor turned 14 was unusually harsh. Snow remained on the ground for weeks. Roads became difficult. Food became expensive. Travel nearly stopped. Inside the manor, people crowded around the fire. The animals were brought closer to the buildings. Servants worked longer hours. And Eleanor's father became sick. At first, nobody was alarmed. A fever, a cough, a few days in bed. Medieval households knew sickness well. There were herbs, prayers, warm cloths, broths, physicians, when available, and a great deal of hope. But the fever did not leave. Eleanor sat beside her father's bed one evening. The room was dark except for a candle. He looked smaller than she remembered. She had always imagined her father as large. Not physically, but emotionally. He had seemed like someone who could solve problems simply by entering the room. Now he struggled to breathe. He looked at Eleanor. For a while he said nothing. Then he asked her to come closer. She did. "I have not protected you enough," he whispered. Eleanor did not understand. "You have," she said. He shook his head. "There are things coming." "What things?" He closed his eyes. Then he opened them again. "The court." She waited. "The court forgets nothing." Eleanor almost smiled. She thought of the king's procession. "The court has never noticed me." Her father looked at her carefully. "That is why you must be careful." It was the last serious conversation they ever had. He died 3 days later. And Eleanor became, in the strange mathematics of medieval inheritance, both more valuable and more vulnerable. She was now an unmarried noble daughter. Her father was gone. Her mother was gone. Her closest protection had disappeared. And suddenly people who had never written to her began writing very frequently. The first letter arrived 2 weeks after the funeral. It carried a seal. Eleanor recognized it immediately. Lord Geoffrey. Agnes read it first. Then she read it again. Then she folded it carefully. "Well?" Eleanor asked. Agnes looked at her. "He wants the marriage." Eleanor felt cold. Now, apparently, outside, snow was falling. Inside, the fire crackled. Agnes placed the letter on the table. "You are not a child anymore." "I know. Do you?" Eleanor looked at the letter. She did not touch it. "I know what they want." Agnes nodded. "And what do you want?" The question sounded almost strange. Nobody had asked her. Eleanor looked toward the small window. Snow covered the courtyard. She thought about her father. She thought about the king. She thought about Lord Geoffrey. And she thought about the life that seemed to be closing around her. "I want to choose," she said. Agnes smiled sadly. "Then you have chosen the most difficult thing. The journey to court. The marriage never happened. Not immediately. Before the arrangements could be completed, a political crisis changed everything. Lord Geoffrey's family became involved in a dispute at court. A rival nobleman challenged their claim to several estates. Then another lord joined the dispute. Then another. Within months, what had begun as an argument over land became a conflict involving powerful families. Geoffrey suddenly needed allies. Eleanor's small inheritance was not enough. He lost interest. And for Eleanor, unexpectedly, this was a kind of freedom. She was sent to live with a distant relative at court. It was supposed to be temporary. A few months, perhaps a year. But the court changed people. It changed Eleanor too. The first time she entered the royal palace, she felt very small. The buildings were larger than anything she had known. The corridors seemed endless. There were guards everywhere. Servants moving quickly. Messengers arriving breathlessly. Ladies wearing elaborate clothing. Knights discussing politics. Priests carrying books. Children running through hallways despite repeated instructions not to. And everywhere there were doors. Doors to private chambers. Doors to council rooms. Doors behind which decisions were being made. Eleanor quickly discovered that the most important conversations often happened behind closed doors. She also discovered that servants knew nearly everything. Not officially, never officially, but they knew. A maid might know which lord was angry. A kitchen worker might know which bishop had argued with the king. A groom might know which knight had arrived at midnight. Information traveled through the palace like smoke. Quietly, everywhere. Eleanor listened. Again, she listened, and people began to underestimate her. That became her greatest advantage. The queen, The queen was older than Eleanor had expected. She was not beautiful in the way songs described queens. She was composed, intelligent, tired. Her name was Matilda. She had been married to the king for many years. She understood court politics better than most men around her. Eleanor first met her in a small chamber where the queen was sorting letters. The queen looked up. "Your father's daughter?" "Yes, Your Grace." "You look nervous." "Yes, Your Grace." The queen smiled. "Good." Eleanor blinked. "Good. People who are never nervous at court are usually dangerous." That was the beginning of their friendship. Not a dramatic friendship. No sudden declarations. No secrets shared beneath moonlight. It grew slowly. The queen began asking Eleanor to read certain letters aloud. Then she asked what Eleanor thought about them. At first Eleanor was careful, very careful. Then, one afternoon, the queen placed a letter before her. "What does he really want?" Eleanor read it. The letter was polite, extremely polite. She looked at the queen. "He wants permission to delay the payment." The queen smiled. "Why?" "Because he says he is unable to pay." And Eleanor looked again. "He says he has suffered unexpected expenses." Which means, Eleanor hesitated. "He has spent the money somewhere else." The queen laughed softly. Exactly. From then on, Eleanor was useful. Not important. Not yet. Useful. And sometimes usefulness is the first step toward power. The forgotten girl. Years passed quietly. Eleanor grew older. She learned how to walk through court without appearing lost. She learned when to speak, when to remain silent, which corridors were safe, which rooms were dangerous, which servants could be trusted. She learned that political power was not always located where people expected. A king might command armies. A queen might influence appointments. But a secretary could control the information reaching the king. A chamberlain could control access. A servant could hear a conversation. A priest could carry a message. And a woman who understood all of these relationships could become surprisingly powerful without anyone noticing. Eleanor remained careful. She did not seek attention. In fact, she cultivated the opposite. She became the forgotten girl again, the quiet one, the woman standing near the wall, the person people did not bother to impress. But while others were speaking, Eleanor was remembering names, debts, promises, insults, family connections, old disputes. She built a map of the court inside her mind. No parchment was needed. No written record could safely contain such things. Her memory became her archive. And then, one evening, the queen asked her a question that changed everything. "Would you like to marry?" Eleanor looked up. She expected a joke. It was not. To whom? The queen did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the fire. "There is a prince." Eleanor's heart began beating faster. Which prince? The king's nephew. Eleanor stared at her. Why me? The queen finally looked at her. Because nobody is watching you. And for the first time, Eleanor understood. Being forgotten was not always a weakness. Sometimes it was protection. Sometimes it was freedom. And sometimes, in a world where everyone was watching the obvious players, the person standing quietly at the edge of the room could become the most important person there. Eleanor did not know what the future held. She did not know that the prince would eventually become king. She did not know that enemies would gather around her. She did not know that one day she would be crowned. And she certainly did not know what the crown would cost. For now, she only knew one thing. Someone had finally noticed the forgotten girl, and history was about to make room for her. The candles burned lower. The palace grew quiet. Outside, the wind moved along the stone walls. And somewhere in the sleeping kingdom, horses shifted beneath their blankets. Eleanor closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would meet the prince, and everything would begin. Not with a battle, not with a coronation, but with a conversation. A quiet conversation that would eventually change the fate of a kingdom. For tonight, however, the palace could sleep. And so could she. Because the girl nobody had remembered was finally standing at the doorway of history. And history, as it often does, had no idea what it was about to create.